Next on the 50s.
Television is a new game. A lot of people don't understand it.
North, east, south, west, everywhere you go.
The debut of TV culture.
We only had CBC, and honest to God, it was deadly.
Hello, I'm Holly Doan. You're watching The 50s, a special series on a remarkable decade in Canada. It was called The Search for Identity. In the 1950s, the government set out to influence what people read and heard and watched in a new medium, television. Canada was to embrace culture, but not without controversy. Watch now as we present the big picture.
This was once the most famous railway parlor car in the country. Millions of Canadians thrilled to get a glimpse of it. It carried the Queen across the country in the heyday of royal tours in the 1950s. Editor Robert Fulford.
When the Queen came on a tour of Canada, it was the #1 journalistic event of that year. And then 2 years later, she came again, and it was another #1 journalistic event. It was an amazing thing.
Crowds cheered every royal visit, 3 in 8 years. The monarchy never seemed so popular. Historian Desmond Morton.
I drove up to Brampton because Her Majesty was going to walk along a street, and I stood there amidst a bunch of smelly and misbehaving children and saw her as about the distance you are from me. And I felt I had been part of history and was none the worse for it, and she looked neat and attractive and pleasant, and so I've seen the Queen. Good on me.
One Canadian diplomat called the decade a new Elizabethan age. When the Queen was crowned in 1953, Canada made it a holiday and awarded commemorative medals to 3 million schoolchildren. Yet the same crowds that waited to see the Queen in the 1950s would cut old ties with the Empire. Canadians, for the first time, sought to celebrate themselves and a unique national identity. Novelist William Weintraub.
Britain became less important in Canada. It's hard for us now to remember how important Britain used to be. We're virtually a colony.
At the University of Toronto, President Sidney Smith, later a Conservative foreign minister, told graduates to be Canadians, proud and fearless.
Don't work for jellyfish. Don't marry jellyfish. Don't bring up jellyfish families. And may I say, without any political bias, don't vote for jellyfish to represent you in the House of Commons.
Historian Jonathan Vance.
I think Canadians have always been searching for a national identity. The difference in the 50s, I think, is that the government decided that that was a job they should take a role in, and so it became part of the public agenda.
MPs, for the first time in the 1950s, considered designing a uniquely Canadian flag, not the Union Jack. Polls showed a majority, for the first time, favored a uniquely Canadian anthem, not God Save the Queen. The government created a national library with 2 copies of every Canadian book. In Ottawa, they proposed to transform what had been a lumber town into a world capital with boulevards and monuments. They created the Canada Council, a $100 million endowment that subsidized everything from ballet to totem poles.
The thought that somebody else's money might go to build me a road or put up more sewers in the village, don't need them anymore. We got those. So we can tolerate the money being spent on the arts, on writers and on musicians and so on, because, you know, it's not a bad thing to do, and it's not going to hurt me.
In Ottawa, the government expropriated a Sussex Drive mansion and turned it into an official residence and showcase for Canadian art. The first to move into the new home for the Prime Minister was Liberal Louis Saint Laurent. He'd created the Canada Council and praised arts and culture as civilizing, he said. Saint Laurent said, "Our Canadian homes would not be so pleasant to live in if the walls were not brightened by the works of Canadian painters."
What was Canada? What was its purpose? The air was full of this stuff.
Automatic teletype.
The air was filled with a new cultural medium that dominated the era.
Radio and television.
It was television, so popular, Canada seemed uncertain what to do with it.
My fellow Canadians,
Television is a new game. A lot of people don't understand it, Saint Laurent included. And I think when they don't understand it, they don't want to deal with it.
Saint Laurent said television must be suitable to our national needs. He delayed its introduction for years after the United States and Europe began broadcasting. Canada went on the air in 1952, just a year ahead of the Philippines, with the opening of CBFT Montreal.
Saint Laurent said this television could be a great force for good for the nation and a very harmful force. As usual, he was being equivocal with one foot in either camp.
Television broadcast 3 hours a day in 2 languages through one network, the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation. The government proposed the CBC Board of Directors own and operate, license, and regulate all television as a federal monopoly. Eric Koch was a network executive and producer.
Who is listening? Who is watching? Who wants this on Sunday night? And I, in my arrogance, supreme arrogance, I'm deeply ashamed, but now I can tell, I said, I don't care. As long as the opinion makers follow this, watch this, that's all I need. That's the audience I need. That's the audience I need. If members of the cabinet watch this, I've done my job.
In asking who would pay for it, taxpayer advocates said, you know who. A CBC executive called it an investment in a strong social force for a better national life. Rogers Communications Vice Chairman Phil Lind.
Oh, yeah, of course it was dull. I mean, we have a farm north of Toronto, and we only had CBC. That's all we had. And honest to God, it was deadly.
In Winnipeg, in 1956, the CBC was flooded with complaints from angry viewers after broadcasting The Marriage of Figaro for 2¼ hours in prime time. It was the only channel in town. The CBC refused to license any others. A newspaperman wrote, that night, it was Figaro or nothing. Former CTV President Murray Churchover.
There's nothing wrong with The Marriage of Figaro. The problem was that the viewers at that time had only The Marriage of Figaro. They didn't have anything else to watch, and they didn't want to watch it.
Marshall McLuhan, University of Toronto professor and media analyst, said of the CBC in 1957, the effect is dullness. In the search for identity in the 1950s, viewers would ask how culture was to be defined and who would define it. In 1949, Canada's former ambassador to London was summoned for a new assignment. He was Vincent Massey, a former Liberal organizer. Massey was to spend 2 years traveling the country, identifying Canadian culture, and report back to Parliament.
The Masseys were Toronto aristocracy. It was a tiresome affectation, but harmless, rather like the monarchy itself, which he represented.
Massey twice tried and failed to win election as a Liberal candidate, and instead received a succession of government appointments. His grandfather made the family fortune manufacturing tractors. Massey said early in life, he was conscious of my own shortcomings as a businessman. Massey's public career culminated with his appointment as Governor General. He was the first Canadian to take the job, but admired the style of his colonial predecessors.
He seemed so nicely British to us, but he wasn't as good an actor as his brother Raymond Massey. But he was British and admired for that Britishness. Perhaps he was pathetic, but certainly he did not give that aura.
Massey appeared in public in a plumed hat and silver-trimmed uniform he had tailored in England. Even British governors had dispensed with such formal dress years before. As Governor General, Massey chose to travel by state carriage, though other governors used the car. Massey said, "I've never felt far away from home in England."
I think there's a timid Englishman and a timid gay at the same time.
In public, Massey spoke with an English accent, though he was born and raised in Toronto.
Especially to those who, during my travels of the past 12 months, have greeted me with such warmth and kindness.
Massey spoke of the nation's self-consciousness. He traveled 200,000 miles across the country to see Canadians where they lived. He was the first Governor General to stand at the bar of the National Press Club in Ottawa and sample the pickled eggs. Massey was the first governor to dance with the Crowfoot tribe in Calgary. They had made him honorary chief. Later, Massey wrote, "The country must not become Americanized," he said. "We are the better Canadians if we remember the legacy of England." In his writings, Massey complained of the American influence on our cultural life.
Did you mean to imply that Canadian culture often takes the form of cultural anti-Americanism?
Massey was pressed on the issue in a 1955 interview with reporter Blair Fraser of Maclean's magazine.
If you were entertaining a dinner party in England, having some Canadians and some Americans whom you didn't know, how would you tell them apart?
That's an extremely good question.
The fact that we had to change identities from the British. It's a negative approach to a change, but things in Canada tend to go better if you think of them as negative changes. Getting rid of something as opposed to embracing something.
In his report on cultural development, Massey made a far-reaching recommendation on the kind of television Canadians would see. He wrote, "Television in the United States was merely an advertising industry, and that commercialism successfully ruins any program."
We were elitist in the sense that were unashamed to put Shakespeare on the air. And we did not take a gallopole down Yonge Street or Portage or whatever and ask, "Do you want to watch Hamlet on the television?" And had we asked, the overwhelming majority of people would say, who needs it?
Canada was to follow the British example of the BBC, with one channel run by one public broadcaster with one ambition: to uplift the audience. First, they had to get it on the air.
When we actually signed on, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, fade in Velocity, cue the music, CBC upside down and backwards. First sign-on officially of the national network.
People who had one of these new TV sets in their house were heroes of the block, and people didn't lock their doors there. And during the evening, neighbors would come in uninvited through the door and seat themselves in the living room to watch the television.
TV sets could cost a week's pay. In 1 year, sales increased 50%. Television sets became the fastest-selling appliances in the country. Newspaperman Ted Byfield.
The astonishing thing was how much money people suddenly found they had, because a set, I'm going from memory, was about $200, which in today's dollars would be somewhere between $2,000 and $3,000. And this was a time when people were supposed to be poor.
The novelty was introduced in classrooms. The Canadian audience grew to more than 3 million. The public rated television a good influence by 3 to 1. A whole generation would always remember its first TV.
I think I was 10 or 11, and there was a TV. Somebody had a TV in our neighborhood. And I remember going up and actually peering, sneaking up and looking in the window to see what this thing was.
Canadians would recall the country's first television spectacle.
Anderson is kicking very definitely. He's passing Landy. Landy looks the wrong way.
It was Roger Bannister's 4-minute mile at Empire Stadium in Vancouver, August 7, 1954. They called it the Miracle Mile.
Dr. Roger Gilbert Bannister of England over John Michael Landy of Australia, 1-2. And Rich Ferguson of Canada was third. What else do you say?
What they were looking at was pretty primitive by today's standards.
58-9.
When you see 1950s television now, you wonder what on earth captivated people. The whole idea was that suddenly you had movies of events in your own city there in your living room the next day. And this was absolutely captivating.
This is quite a place, Russ. These fellas have been after me since I started to play hockey in here.
We're quite worried about the new Unemployment Insurance Act and the way it discriminates against our men.
Rough play. Offside.
Proven winner in his own province. Next winner in the nation. Great citizen of the West.
First prize, at least $15,000 or all the silver dollars you can shovel in 5 minutes.
And I promise you'll go a long, long time before you see another event like that.
To broadcast events like the Miracle Mile to a national audience, engineers first had to transmit the images through a logistical maze.
From Seattle.
From Vancouver by cable and microwave, pictures of the Empire Games were carried through Denver, Chicago, New York, Buffalo, and finally Toronto and points east.
Hundreds of men involved.
Where a single television tower in New York could reach millions of viewers, a comparable Canadian audience could only be reached by hundreds of towers. The installation by Northern Electric of the microwave network spanned 4,000 miles from Cape Breton to Vancouver. It cost the modern equivalent of nearly $500 million and was rated one of the great engineering achievements of the decade. Canada was hooked up from coast to coast.
It's hard to describe the impact that it had. More so, I think, than radio 20, 25 years earlier. And because you could see the pictures. And you could also see the people in your own, on your own city council. You could see the city council meeting, and people, politicians making speeches, and they were there.
North, east, south, west, everywhere you go. Northern Electric is the name to know. From coast to coast in Canada, and east surges west. Serving home and serving industry, energy stands the test. North, east, south, west, everywhere. Northern Electric serves you best.
To pay for its use of the Trans-Canada Network, the CBC at first proposed a television tax. It was a $15 license fee to be collected from everyone who owned television sets.
This was considered impractical. You couldn't collect. Too many people would not pay. It was considered unworkable.
Members of Parliament instead agreed to finance the CBC with an annual grant and a 15% luxury tax on TV sets. And one thing more. No private TV in the big cities. The CBC was granted a monopoly to restrict competitors.
Their God was profit, money, filthy lucre. They served, that's what the advertisers. Advertisers, can you imagine? Advertising, promoters. That is diabolical work. We, on the other hand, this was a kind of us versus them. We were selfless. We were serving not just the country, but we served a kind of standard of knowledge, principle, that was above money.
CBC Chairman Arnold Davidson Dutton, a former Montreal newspaperman, said, "We could have a cheap television system in Canada. The CBC model promised a better national life," he said. Private broadcasting was only licensed in smaller cities, while the CBC monopolized the largest markets in the country. It meant Regina, with CKCK TV, had private television on the air 6 years before Toronto.
This was a real fight, and it was a liberating fight in many people's minds, because they had to get out from under the CBC. The CBC was an incredibly powerful company in those days.
It was a battle right from start to finish.
Veteran broadcaster Foster Hewitt, a CBC commentator and private radio executive, complained of the policy. Hewitt told a reporter, "It looks to me as though the government has chosen the most lucrative spots. They pick the bone clean," he said. One private broadcaster said of the CBC, "It was a tax-free, subsidized, government-owned operation that was judge, jury, policeman, competitor, prosecutor, hangman, all in one." The network's president, Alphonse Ouimet, spoke of public service.
And we feel that in a great many homes, CBC Radio and CBC Television have become members of the family.
If you can keep it small and you keep it only the CBC, we can control it. If you start putting out licenses and allowing competition, we can regulate it, but we can't control it. It's not ours. It's the public's.
In 1955, Ottawa appointed a federal commission specifically to study broadcasting. It was the Fowler Commission, named for its chairman, Robert Fowler, a pulp and paper executive. Fowler told a reporter he found television curiously powerful. He said, "Could it remain a monopoly?"
I think a lot of people are afraid where television is going to go. I mean, this is a medium that, again, doesn't allow for border controls, comes over on the airwaves. Once it starts, how are we going to regulate it? How are we going to say what stations can and can't broadcast?
In 1957, the Royal Commission proposed changes. Parliament would create an independent regulator, what became the Canadian Radio, Television and Telecommunications Commission.
Incidentally, just
The CBC, for the first time, was stripped of its power to license its competition. Most Canadians, for the first time, had more than one channel to watch.
Let's go now to Halifax. And the question this time is from Darrell Warrington of Canadian Press.
Mr. Ouimet, what effect will the new regulatory body for radio and television in Canada have on the future operations of the CBC? Will it be a handicap, do you think?
I wish I knew. I think you better ask that question directly to the government.
And we watched aghast because we found that the enemy, or this in quotation marks, don't take it too literally, the enemy, in quotes, was capable of doing programs that were as good as ours. That was quite amazing, and I'm still amazed.
Well, the CBC, I think, was elitist from the start, and they had a very paternalistic view of where broadcasting ought to go, what broadcasting ought to be, and certainly protectionist in the sense that they wanted their station on, but nobody else's station on for a long time.
In 1959, in the last days of single-channel broadcasting, the CBC released an audit of its programming. It revealed losses on most CBC shows. Only 17 of 102 programs made a profit despite a monopoly. The band concerts and cultural programs, most of the shows designed to uplift the audience, were unprofitable. 8 out of 10 lost money for lack of viewers. In Canada's golden age of television, one program reported a large profit, 475%. The hockey.
And Pulford went at each other. Now Flavin's trying to get in it. Every man on the ice has gone on the ice. So this is one of the wildest games played for a long, long time. Hillman is fighting over on the far side. Horton gets in it.
You have a broad general audience composed of a lot of elements. Serve them all. That's golden.
Rough play. Offside. Holding. Ball illegally put in play. Offside pass. Incomplete forward pass. No yards. Illegal interference. Ineligible receiver. Clipping. Talking back. Infraction of rules. Rouge. Safety touch. Touchdown.